Thank you very much, Sanya. And our next speaker is Dušan Barok. Please, Dušan.
Yeah, I will need maybe 2 minutes to set up.
Please, go ahead. Dušan is the founder of the Monoscope, monoscope.org, and I would like to grab the opportunity to wish a happy birthday, because Monoscope was established 2004, and his talk will be artist organizing and para-institutional practices in the semi-peripheries. Welcome, Dušan. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Where this can go probably. Okay. Thank you so much to yeah, good morning. Good morning. So thank you so much to all the organizers for the invitation. And thank you to all the people involved who contributed their time and labor to this event. It's a big honor to be part of it. So I will start with this. So for the past 2 months, a cultural strike has been going on in Slovakia. Art workers are reading out demands and statements in theaters, at concerts, festivals, and at openings. There is an unprecedented wave of solidarity throughout the country, with artists, writers, and musicians of all generations standing together inside and outside institutions, but also with workers in other sectors, counting some 4,000 people and 400 organizations. Venues, offices, and streets are plastered with posters of the movement, which began earlier this year. It was triggered by the actions of the Ministry of Culture, but also by the wider government standing behind it, which took power in the country a year ago with an insecure 3-seat majority in the parliament. The strike denounces the destruction of the heritage protection system, the dismantling of the support system for culture, incompetent management and destructive influence in established organizations, and the violation of the working conditions of culture workers. None of the demands have been met, and the recent increase in dismissals of employment has opened up discussion about the possibility of moving to a sharp strike in which people stop going to work. So the movement has formulated 3 main demands. One is professional and competent management of the Department of Culture. The other is a halt to ideologically motivated censorship in the arts and media, including TV and radio. And the third, fair remuneration system to financially stabilize the sector. In support of these demands, a labor union of culture workers has been established also recently. Even though the movement didn't yet achieve much on a political level, and governmental politicians do everything to avoid direct confrontation, we don't remember such a wave of solidarity in and beyond the culture sector in at least 30 years. So in my talk, I would like to draw parallels with the situation after the revolutions of '89 in Czechoslovakia and Hungary, which to some extent laid the groundwork for the interdisciplinary and also international collaboration and solidarity to come. Of particular interest here are initiatives led by artists themselves. I'm going to discuss and try to compare the situation around Herwig Foundation and the Intermedia Center Plus in Czechia, the RT Studio in Nové Zámky, Slovakia, the Society for Unconventional Music in Bratislava, and the Media Research Foundation in Budapest. Also, they also presented works that fit into the registers of visual art. These initiatives were defined by activities that are usually considered as non-artistic, or as processes supporting artistic practice, whether organizing, debating, curating, or publishing. Their activities usually transcended and linked more narrowly defined artistic categories such as visual art, music, or theater, and were conceived in the form of regular symposia and festivals rather than exhibitions as such. So for this, I will draw on a longer-term project called We Have Never Been Closer, realized during pandemic together with Ivana Romanova, who is very involved in the culture strike and also in the Artists' Labor Union in Slovakia. Our starting point was the assumption that roots of some of the crisis today can be traced back to what happened after the regime changes in the early 90s. As part of this project, we held conversations with artists who were active in different communities in that time, in our wider geographic region, as well as with artists and researchers of younger generations. Some of these conversations took place in the setting of the exhibition of the same name and have been posted online. We were interested in phenomena that were to some extent present in the environment of these initiatives, particularly those that resonated with these younger generations today. Another motivation for exploring these aspects is the fact that in artist organizing, the tension between the autonomy of art production and its social dimension is more prominent. After 1989, artists in this environment were offered new opportunities to engage in social life, in which they could now participate more directly and intensively as citizens. Also, freedom of association and expression did not become absolute. They were given a wider space to influence public affairs. A synergistic motive for many was the organization of public events that created space for a diverse variety of creative strategies. This, of course, is also closely linked to the ongoing social reorganization. Taking active roles in societies and foundations, no longer tied to the state apparatus, has become one way of participating in this reorganization. As in the case of the earlier communities of the 70s and 80s, the use of the conditions of mutual exchange and intensively lived moment seems to be important here as well. Artist organizations of the 90s continued to do this, but the situation of time lived together became a public matter. Event venues have expanded from the periphery and private sphere to public spaces, and event venues have expanded, public spaces, venues, and media. Participants from circles of friends are joined by acquaintances, their acquaintances, and the wider public. There begins to merge a wide variety of clubs, associations, societies, companies, and foundations, as well as festivals, symposia, campaigns, protests, and strikes. In this context, the 90s are associated with the international emergence of socially engaged and participatory art, which develop strategies of subtle resistance to inequalities, both within society and within the artistic context itself. By no means all such work was immune to the liberal version of the politics of art, to give audience a choice and thereby satisfying a democratic demand, which was the case with a lot of the work associated with relational aesthetics as well as with interactive media art. However, there were also more refined practices as well as expressions of solidarity in the artistic environment. In the case of artist organizations, the level of self-institutionalization and its associated consequences for the position of the artist as well as for creative strategies come into play. Artists have taken on a whole spectrum of roles requiring different competences. Leveraging between the roles of artist, writer, organizer, curator, or editor, they encourage and nurture the performative instinct to switch and change identities according to context, situation, and need. Art, organizing, and activism were thus considered by many to be in the same field, suited to a given setting. And to quote János Sugár, they saw their role as creating access and increasing the density of events. They could also create legal entities for this purpose, from civic associations to foundations to state organizations. Or they could go directly into politics. So Ilona Nemet and Roko Juhász met in the late 80s in the visual section of the Irodia Poetry Circle and were in close contact with a wide range of writers and artists from the unofficial scenes in both Czechoslovakia and Hungary. Then, a day after the Velvet Revolution, they took part in the formation of the Hungarian Independence Initiative in Czechoslovakia. They delved deeper into politics and started making films, posters, and newspapers for the new political entity. At this time, they fully believed that the country was moving in the right direction, although surprises and sobering up gradually came. Firstly, from the fact that the national question was too broad a base to give rise to a coherent political subject. Secondly, from the helplessness in situations where they were over or outvoted by colleagues, but also from the first demonstrations for the fascist Slovak state and for the rehabilitation of its president Josef Tiso. After a few months, they finally decided to withdraw from party politics altogether and return to their own work and the organization of this Trans Art Communication Festival within the framework of the Civic Association Arte Studio. Transfer took place annually since 1988 in an environment and conditions more or less without funding, DIY. The festival was an example of a phenomenon where many artists created with what they had. Their own bodies, their movement, their own presence, and with found or borrowed objects. In this respect, it was nothing new compared to the previous times. Such performative strategies were widely known, accessible, and also realized by a wide range of artists, especially those in the underground, grey zone, or a second public sphere, even during the normalization years in Czechoslovakia or Hungary. What was new was the audience, which paradoxically was to some extent also the reason for certain intergenerational tensions. Representatives of the older generation associated with the concept of action or happening often perceived performance as a theatrical action, a dramatic stage form. This was also due to the situating of the pieces in this Nové Zámky festival primarily on a stage, or in a community center or in a cinema in front of the audience. As well as references to Grotowski Poor Theater or Japanese Buto, which were anchored primarily in the theatrical tradition. Thematically, these performances were not only personal mythologies, but in many cases also about ecological, political, and feminist themes. In Bratislava since the late 80s, there has been a creative underbelly around the musicologist, composer, and performer Milan Adamczak, who is an example of a second public sphere actor who was also active in the official sphere. The onset of normalization following the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in '68 hit him at the age of 23. He joined the party and worked in the Slovak Academy of Sciences. Despite his contradictory past, in the late 80s, 20 years onward, despite his contradictory past and his appearance as an academic in a suit, he was integrative to a circle composed of younger generations. He initiated the audiovisual performance collective Transmusic.com, as well as the Society for Unconventional Music. As one of, so this SNEG was, or in Slovak means snow, it was one of the several sections of Music Association which was formed after the dissolution of the Union of Slovak Composers. SNEG was an institution with subsidies directly from the state budget until 1993. A milestone in activities of the society was the Festival of Intermedia creation in 1991. Participants later described it as an emotional, spontaneous event, which included a performance by Transmusic Comp in Bratislava's Klaristi. The festival program also brought together experimental theater, Balvan and Stoka, physical theater, or visual artists, Stanofilko, Julius Koller, or Juraj Bartoš. As with many other festivals and symposia, the dramaturgical collage of visual art, theater, and music offers parallels with Fluxus, whose influence resonated in their interdisciplinarity and the ambiguity of individual formal categories. Although Fit's program was built around Viktor Hulik's exhibition, it was not dominated by any one creative discipline. Rather, it was natural for artists, directors, composers, and poets to share a common platform, as has been the case with many other events. The Center for Multimedia Metamedia in a former Cistercian monastery in Plazy near Pilsen, Czechia, founded by Miklósvölgyi and others, provided opportunities for interdisciplinary collaboration for artists, theoreticians, and students, mainly in the form of symposia and festivals under the banner of Herbit between 1992 and 1999. The topology of the site of these events lends itself to site-specific interventions and installations, and also led to a conflation of the roles of artists and spectators, with the interventions of individual artists so dispersed in time and space that it was not obvious who did what. And in this absence of institutional frame of artistic outputs, the artist and audience became one group, wandering around and communicating with each other. The limits of institutional service induced a kind of egalitarian situation, where performers were often left to negotiate with locals who helped them and had their own opinions, unfiltered by the unwritten rules of the art world. The starting point for many of these initiatives was distance from art centers and a certain distrust of large institutions. Artists felt it necessary to create their own conditions and infrastructure in order to present their work. Thus, informal friendly associations began to form legal entities in which the intended horizontality of collaboration was subordinated to systemic conditions, with one person becoming the statutory member, few others the founding members with certain rights and obligations, while the rest of the circle remained outside of these frameworks. However, despite some assistance from ministries of culture and later from several foreign institutes, these functions could only support a person exceptionally. Participation in events was also generally unremunerated, so without fees, although it usually involved the production of a commissioned work. There was thus a certain tension between reciprocity or non-financial or even friendly help, continued from the days of the alternative underground and second public sphere, in which art was simply not considered a job, or was considered more than a job, and the need to be able to pay monthly expenses or support the family. Yet few saw this approach as self-exploitation. It was more about an altruistic mission to, or for the well-being of a nascent democratic society, or an attitude that money did not belong in the free arts. The environment, with incomparably large budget, was no exception to this. To give an example, in 1993, Tamás Szentjobbik Tamás proposed a project for the annual exhibition of the Hungarian branch of SCCA, dedicated to socially engaged art, in which he emphasized the persistent tradition of not-paid artists. The project consisted of reducing the intensity of evening public lighting in Budapest for a short period of time, in order to apply the money saved in this way to the fees of the artists participating in this exhibition. It was ultimately rejected by the committee as technically unfeasible. Although the artists became self-employed, they paradoxically ceased to be workers. Art was free in another sense as well. It was not only a freedom, but also gratis. Despite freedom of movement and freedom of media, artists in the early 90s generally had only very mediated view of what was happening in art centers outside their province and region. The initiatives mentioned above stood out because they were already connected to an international context. Miklósvölgyi initially prepared the Symposium Plaza from Amsterdam, where he had a small gallery, and for the first edition, almost 20 performers came with him from Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, and Poland, with the number increasing in the following years. Since 1991, Sněh events have featured performers from Czechia and Austria, as well as from the United States. In Novi Zámky, due to its location, but also due to a longer tour of college clubs in Czechoslovakia, they had contacts in several places, as well as in Budapest. Their festivals were thus primarily Slovak, Hungarian, Czech. For the second edition, artists came from Vojvodina, 2 years later also from Poland, Romania, Baltic states, France, Switzerland. Thus, they were not only oriented to the west, but also to the south and to the north. Soon, okay. The participants came into a multilingual environment in which they were often dependent on non-verbal or mediated communication, as few knew English. Participation was especially meaningful for those who did not come for one evening, but wanted to spend time together, or time in the proximity of artists from abroad, equally curious about local work and realities, and equipped with, from today's point of view, incredible patience. Such social environments were created for a few days or longer. And the cyclical nature of these events, to which many returned repeatedly, also increased their intensity. Presence was therefore a key aspect. The combination of language barriers and prolonged presence ultimately contributed to creating an environment in which performative installation forms were more effective, where words did not play a central role. And this brings us to the example of somewhat different context in Budapest. To begin with, in December '89, Hungary experienced live television coverage of Romanian pro-democracy revolution. In Hungary, where power had already been demonopolized by then, this matter resonated strongly, not least because Romania has a large Hungarian population. Of course, some of the exchanges between the state apparatus and the democratic opposition during the Belgrade Revolution in Czechoslovakia were also broadcast live, and footage from squares eventually made its way into airwaves. But in the case of Romanian Revolution, the crowd literally occupied the state media buildings and took control of television and radio broadcast, which became a fully extended arm of the squares. For the viewers, it was an experience of a kind of a social video performance with far-reaching consequences, and also a particular visuality caused by the raw conversion of the Romanian SECAM television image signal to the Hungarian PON system, which was then sent back to Romania. This event was also activated a part of the art scene, which, in order to reflect on what had happened, organized an international symposium at Kunsthalle entitled Media Art with Us. I'm afraid, like this, yeah, this would be another 5 minutes. Shall I?
Let me ask. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay.
We have to keep.
Yeah. Okay, so this would be about the local situation, but I will need to skip. Sorry about that. And yeah, just to conclude, so yeah, there were a large variety of topics that I think resonate still today, including the role of English as a primary language for non-native speakers, self-organization, working for free, or conflation of artistic and para-artistic practices, and things like that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dušan. And a short remark, Dušan mentioned the art strike as the first slide. And first of all, we want to express our solidarity with the Slovakian situation, especially